Welcome back to Rethinking Politics. We're glad to have you here with us for episode 59. So we mentioned last week that there were a few things in the news, and we were going to take those things one topic at a time, which means now we're a couple weeks late talking about Biden's new COVID plan as well as his announced COVID vaccine mandate that's going to be implemented through OSHA and affect, I think the estimate is about 100 million Americans could potentially be impacted by that mandate. I don't believe OSHA has come out with the official documentation yet. I've been watching that pretty closely as I work for a company that employs over 100 employees and have not yet been vaccinated, so this is going to directly impact me as once it comes into effect. And so I know nothing's happened yet because everyone in my business is like, what's going to happen? Because we haven't been told anything. But anyways, it has been announced, it is coming, and we do have a decent idea of what it's going to look like, which is pretty simple, which is that OSHA is going to require any business with over 100 employees to require that employees are vaccinated or that they get weekly testing. We don't know who's going to be paying for that testing. We don't know what the requirements are going to look like for that testing. We don't know exactly how that's going to be implemented and verified by OSHA, but we do know the general plan.
Yeah, it is what it is. I've seen, at least thus far, there's been no successful challenges to it. I don't know what the state of that is legally, if there's still a chance that it'll get thrown out by the Supreme Court or by some other means for not meeting the standard that is required for these kind of emergency authorizations. But so far, it remains the plan. It remains what's going to be happening whether you like it or not. And in case this is surprising at all, we don't care for it so much. Spoiler alert.
It's funny, Dan, because, we've been talking about Biden in the past, and something I've said, at least in private conversations, I'm not sure I ever said it here, but if I hadn't, I'll say it now, and that's that one of the things Biden campaigned on very strongly was how he was going to end this pandemic and how he was going to do things differently than Trump and how Trump had completely botched it and Biden was going to fix it. And then Biden gets into office, and the main thing he does is continue on schedule with Trump's vaccine rollout and complete what Trump started in terms of the vaccine, get the vaccine pushed out. None of that is an original Biden idea, right? It's just a continuation of what's already going on.
Yeah, it worked through the state governors.
Yeah.
Didn't try and bypass them in any way. Mm-hmm. Continued to negotiate with them.
And then the only other thing he did that was different than Trump is he whined about the American public not listening to him. Otherwise, he hasn't really done a whole lot that's different than Trump. He's been very upset that people aren't getting vaccinated, but hasn't done a whole lot, which hasn't exactly lived up to his campaign promise. And as COVID cases have continued to rise, it's become more and more of a political problem for Biden, because this is one of his cornerstones of his presidency, is how he handles COVID. That's how he's going to be remembered. And that's why, for the past few weeks, he's been pushing against the unvaccinated so hard. We've talked before about the fact that even if you got 100% vaccination rate in the United States, and I'm saying 100%, that wouldn't have stopped the Delta variant from spreading, because it would have come from where it originated, India, which was not in the United States. We've discussed this before, but the fact is to Biden, that doesn't really matter. What matters is that he needs to have someone to blame for the fact that he has completely failed in honoring his campaign promise, the campaign promise that people are most interested that he honor. Presidents always come short on their campaign promises, but they also understand they need to do at least a couple things in order to get reelected, and he's failed when it comes to COVID, and that's why he's raised the unvaccinated as the boogeyman that's responsible for the fact that he's failed. And this mandate is simply a continuation of that. Because
let me interject one quick thing. You say he failed. I think that is exactly the right word, and I think a lot of people will be upset about it. It's exactly the right word because what matters is not what Biden did or how well it worked. That you can table that. That's not to say Biden failed is not a critique of his policies and things. We have critiqued his policies and ideas at other times. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is the numbers are going to look like he failed, right? The fact that Delta comes in and you get a huge spike right now, right? This is not what was supposed to happen. There was a story he told. That story has not turned out to be true.
Well, and that's
right? It's not what the world looks
problem,
like.
Dan, is that what he said is that all those COVID deaths, every single one that occurred during Trump's presidency, occurred because Donald Trump failed, and he was directly responsible for them because of his failed policies. And so a lot of people have to be thinking, well, if Trump's responsible for every COVID death under Trump's presidency, which is what Biden argued, doesn't that then follow that Biden's responsible for every COVID death under his presidency? See, I think why you're clarifying there, Dan, is that you're saying we don't believe that Biden or Trump were responsible for the COVID deaths that occurred under their presidency. The problem is that Biden made that the argument. Biden basically created the rules for this game, and now according to the rules that he has created, he's failing miserably. Because he didn't say, hey, I'm going to do things better and I'm going to improve things. He said, I'm going to end this pandemic.
Yes,
and
there's been a massive
shift
in independence. Yes, there's been a massive shift in independence, in part because of Afghanistan and in part because of COVID.
Yeah, and the two things he's going to have to answer to, the things he's going to be remembered for, does not make him look good, and so he's doing everything he can to change that.
Right, which comes to your point there, which is that he needs something he can point to that says, despite the fact I'm doing the right thing, it's failed. Why? Afghanistan, it was the collapse of the
Afghanistan military,
Afghani government, their military. Here, it's a little tougher, and as you said, he's making the case that it's the unvaccinated, and thus this vaccination rollout is supposed to solve that. You know, I've heard people estimate that we're 80+% COVID immune at this point because of if you count the cases of people who got it and then in the natural immunity, which is going to be superior to the vaccine, that they would have from it. It's hard to believe that raising those numbers is going to have a massive impact. As you said, the Delta variant doesn't seem to care that much. It matters. But as far as the optics go in the raw case count, it wouldn't change that much.
Absolutely. But anyways, that brings us back to what's actually happening on the ground, which is Biden's solution is because he understands that if he passes an executive order mandating that every adult in the United States who's medically eligible to has to be vaccinated, he knows that two things are going to happen. The first is it's likely going to be struck down. And if it's not going to get struck down, he's going to have so much political pushback that it won't be worth it. You know what I mean? That it could in many ways destroy his presidency. And that's something that he's not willing to do, right? And so instead, he's trying to do a workaround. It's interesting because he did a similar thing a while back with the eviction moratorium, where the eviction moratorium was going to be struck down, and so he had the CDC tweak it and try and get it to sneak by changing the wording of it, and then it got struck down anyways. And what you're seeing here is something similar, where he's going to use an agency, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health. What's the
Association?
Administration.
I don't know. Administration.
I couldn't remember what the A was. I wanted to say agency, but I'm glad I didn't, because it's administration, which is totally different. Administration and agency, fundamentally different.
As you go through that, I realize I've never actually thought about it or heard the name. Just OSHA is all I know.
But anyways,
I didn't even realize. I thought there was a C in it. Now that you mention it,
there's no C. I've got our episode notes up here, and I went ahead and changed the letters for you, Dan, because Dan was over there trying to spell ocean. And that's not right.
Minus the N. Who knows what that would have stood for?
Anyways, but now I've lost my train of thought, Dan. All I'm thinking about is OSHA and oceans and how they're going to save the dolphins.
Well, you mentioned that he's using agencies to try and do a workaround. And this is in the same way that when we were talking about Afghanistan, one of the things that we thought would be helpful would be to talk about the disconnect between the people who run the policies and the people on the ground who vote for these politicians and things, and how propaganda was necessary in almost every case in all of the major wars to bring the people to the opinions of the rulers. And that by seeing that, it might change your perception of what it means to unite in a war effort, right? And when you see the propaganda arm necessary to make that happen, when you see the fact that the interests of the average person just doesn't align with that, we thought that might be more useful than more noise on top of the already very noisy critique of the details of the Afghanistan withdrawal, which you've no doubt gotten into if you're interested in the politics at all. In the similar case, what's interesting here is that this workaround is possible. And looks like it might even be successful, right? Mm-hmm. You have Congress, you have the president and the executive branch that he represents, his immediate officers and things. And you have, who are all exercising his authority. They have no authority beyond him. And then you have the Supreme Court, and none of these are making this call. This is the call of some other group that has all of the force of law. And how that works and why that works is crazy. It's very different.
And yeah, as we're looking at this, Dan, the question comes, as you've already raised, is this law going to be struck down? What are the legal challenges that are going to come against this law? And like we said before, if it was an executive order, it'd be very different. And so I was curious, what are the legal hurdles that are going to have to be passed for this law to get through? And so I looked it up, and it's crazy. So the Department of Labor, which OSHA is underneath, has the ability to issue, in quotes, an emergency temporary standard that's designed to protect workers from new hazards, as long as, in quote, employees are exposed to grave danger and it's necessary to protect them from that danger. And I'm reading that language, and I'm like, oh yeah, this thing is going to stand. This thing is going to stand. It's going to stand just fine. Which, of course, then begs the question, how much power does OSHA have? You know what I mean? How much power does the Department of Labor have, this organization, this administration, this agency, to be able to issue something that has about as much power as a large executive order that would be struck down and yet have it stand?
Right. Or even you say executive order. This is in a lot of ways, it's more comparable to a law. This is a new policy being implemented on the way businesses work and the requirements they face.
No, and I compare it to an executive order because that's often how executive orders are discussed. Yes. The executive orders people are interested in are the ones where the president starts pushing into legislative realms when he tries to legislate by decree, because we all believe that the Department of Labor is a branch of the executive government. And so if the Department of Labor is passing a law, it is very similar in function as if the president is signing an executive order, because it's clear here that this is not the Department of Labor acting on their own. This is Biden's plan that is being implemented through the Department of Labor.
Yes, which is so odd, and you're right that does then make it the useful standard comparison, because you'd say that the executive branch's power is concentrated into the hands of an executive. That's the president of the United States. Mm-hmm. The president can give orders, he can receive counsel from whoever he wants. He can give orders to whoever he wants to carry out his will. But there is no power, executive power, beyond the power of the president. So if an executive order is insufficient to do something, an agency that is derivative of that power,
that is underneath the president.
Right. It seems impossible to get to by reason any way in which they could then have more power than the president as this subsidiary of the president whose authority is exclusively what the president has given them. Or that's not how it works, which is the problem.
It doesn't make sense.
But in theory, right, as being part of the executive branch, as being under the executive, they would be limited to that same executive authority that is given in the Constitution. Even with the developed constitutional law, as you're saying, the president can't do this. Yet OSHA can. And if that disconnect isn't weird and worth getting into, this is something so common, actually, at this point in time. OSHA is not doing something unique here. It's doing something actually incredibly ordinary, just in a way that's far more public than we normally see. So we want to get into that a little bit. Dig into these agencies. Some people have called them a fourth branch of government, and, well, the title is probably warranted to at least some extent, though they're not technically a fourth branch. The way the Constitution is designed is, hopefully I'm pretty sure anybody listening to this is going to feel like I'm talking down to them. I get that you probably get this, right? You've got the three branches.
No, but you want to establish
the
clear
groundwork.
Common
Yes,
ground.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. This is going to be a refresher for everyone, but
Right.
But even for me, Dan, so that I understand your full argument. Carry on. Tell me about the three branches. How does a bill become a law?
How does a bill... I start singing a song and
I was
dancing
waiting
around.
for you to.
Not happening.
I'll watch the video later.
So you get the Supreme Court, right? The Supreme Court, I'm going to just set aside, is they decide things in a case and controversy that ends up being very narrow in consideration. They have a lot of power at this point, but in part it's because the others are not towing their weight. Most of the power is in the legislative branch. The legislative branch makes the laws. The laws are enforced by the executive. Now, in terms of foreign policy, the executive has far more power than that. They have some legitimate freedom to make calls under the Constitution to do all kinds of things. But as far as domestic affairs go, almost all of the power that's relevant is in Congress. Congress makes the laws. The executive branch enforces them. If there is some kind of problem, some kind of case and controversy, right, that may pit two laws against each other, then you bring in the Supreme Court to mediate that. And that can have a real impact on the laws, but it's a far cry from the power of being able to create a law. And the laws are limited by certain constitutional principles, or at least were at one point. At this point, you can essentially make a law about. There's a lot of things you make laws about. There's still some limits. There's still things you can't do that would be struck down, even by in a bipartisan way by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, but in general, the things that Congress can make laws about are not just fractionally larger than they were, 200 years ago, but we're talking exponentially larger than they were 200 years ago. I mean, just recently I mentioned, the Interstate Commerce Clause and how that's been abused to allow the federal government to make laws on most issues that they really never should have.
Yes.
In terms of how it was constitutionally structured at the beginning.
Yes, the Commerce Clause is one of the most clear places where the Constitution has been interpreted in such a way that the power of Congress has evolved in ways that were far beyond the text and beyond the initial meaning. So, the executive branch.
Sorry,
go ahead. Please.
I'm not sure how you're planning on telling the story, and so I didn't want to steal your story. I was just bringing that up to talk about the fact that the Congress has grown so much in scope in terms of what they're doing that you reach a point where it's difficult for them to do that anymore. But I believe that I'm derailing your story, and so I just want you to continue, and I'm going to shut up for a little bit.
That is the key detail here. And the point I was going to make before jumping into that is just that the executive branch was extremely limited, really, in what it can do with regard to laws. It can execute them. Now, it turns out, if you know anything about a prosecuting attorney, one of the most interesting things about a prosecutor is that at any given moment they have more cases, generally, this is most of the time, and depending where you are, this is all the time, they have more cases than they could possibly prosecute fully, because they don't have the resources to really treat all of them with equal weight. And so they actually end up with quite a bit of discretionary power because of that. And that's absolutely true with the government. And I think has been true basically forever. Of course, if you have less things to do, that's less true. But there are often times where there is discretionary power in the enforcing agency because it can decide how to allocate the resources to deal with it. How much attention are they going to give a particular issue matters.
Absolutely.
And at this point, that gives the executive massive discretion. There are a number of laws where they literally are like, you know what? This is a law, and I'm not going to enforce it. And it used to be they would have to make a pretext about that. They'd have to be like, because we don't have the funding, or we don't have or because this other thing is such a big issue. A good example of that is the limbo state of our immigration laws, which was making big news. And right now, every time there's a large influx, a large group of people come in, it makes news. What happens with our immigration laws varies immensely depending on the executive. But this brings us to an interesting problem. As it grows, the executive naturally gets more discretionary power as there are more issues to tackle in a variety of resources and forms. And the grayer it gets, the more discretion you have. The more complex it gets, the more discretion you have. With the legislative body, this is absolutely true. With the beginning of kind of the progressive era, the late 1800s into the early 1900s, that it's going to culminate and really take off with FDR and the New Deal. You have this immense change in political theory that people will look back at that time. They'll say what happened is you get this response where, due to changing economic circumstances, the government has to adapt to those and it changes. That's half true at best. Due to changing economic theories, the government decides it's going to do more. Is a big part of that, right? You get a real sense of people who are looking at Germany and the planned economy of Germany pre-World War I and even into World War I, and then later into Russia and the planned economy there, and to Italy and with Mussolini and different things. You get these moments where they're looking at these planned is a word that comes up a lot there, these planned economies, and they think that is the future because it's so much more effective. Now, I think it's actually much worse in every single way, other than obtaining the goals of the politician who is doing the planning. But that aside, you get this massive growth in what government is trying to do and how it's trying to micromanage the economy. This is where a lot of the changes in that interstate commerce clause you mentioned really become egregious. They really, really start to look gross.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where it's truly an abuse of language, what happens to it. But this is also where agencies begin to appear and become really cemented. But it's really, really strange how they appear. Because you'd think they're a part of the executive branch, so what happens is the president creates them. That's not what happens. That's not how they start. What happens is the legislative branch wants to do all these things, so instead of saying, this is the law, enforce it, they say, this is the goal, make it happen, and importantly, keep it up to date. Because so much of what they want to do, the economic micromanagement, involves adjusting prices to meet changing circumstances on a regular basis. A good example of this is a Supreme Court case called Hampton and Co. versus United States. You get a tariff act in 1922 that empowers the executive to equalize differences in costs of production at home and the costs in competing foreign countries. And you're going to use tariffs to equalize the costs of goods. Production at home with competing countries. We don't want this country with their planned economy to get ahead of us and be able to undercut us. So what we're going to do is we're going to put tariffs on their goods so that our prices stay competitive. This thing is so old. This is like basically what Trump ran on with China. and it's a major policy of this era. And eras before it. It's this economic idea and the ideas that drive it won't seem to die. In fact, they seem to get stronger with every year, unfortunately. But that aside, the goal here is given, a very clear goal. We want these prices equalized, and there's more. I'm summarizing the bill. And the Supreme Court looks at this and goes, can the legislative branch pass an act that allows the president that kind of discretion? And they go, yeah, you know what? That's fine. That's fine. They affirm the case. It goes through. And the idea is the president, what he's doing is really clear. in this case, it's probably not the president. Maybe it's people he appointed, right? But it's given to the president.
It's a function of the executive branch.
It's a function of the executive branch. The legislative has made a law with a clear, intelligible principle. Intelligible principle is a big term that they use in these constitutional law cases regarding this. They need an intelligible principle that limits the power of what the president can do. And they go, that's fine. And in a lot of ways, this case is the beginning, is the seed in some sense of what comes with these agencies. A second case, Schechter Corporation versus the United States. In this, you get the National Industrial Recovery Act, which is huge.
Well, and Dan, before you go into that, I want to provide a brief summary of what just happened here, because as someone who's less familiar
stop me at
than
any
you,
time, this historical account.
I can see where the confusion would come in. Basically, what you're saying is that previously, Congress had the ability to pass laws. The president and the executive branch had the ability to enforce them. But up until this point, for the most part, Congress would be passing static laws. A great example, you're talking about tariffs, would be they pass a tariff, so a tax on imports and exports of a set amount. And then after they do that, the president would then be, and the executive branch would then be responsible for enforcing that static law. The law is not changing. The tariff stays the same. The president uses his resources to enforce it. Done. Simple. Now, with this new case and this new legislative function, the legislature is saying, we need you to regulate the prices given this certain principle. This is our goal, is to compete with these other countries, it is like companies, because they're talking about, they're describing the country as if it's a company. Compete with these other countries economically, and in order to do that, we want you to do A, B, and C, and then the president and the executive branch forms an organization to then implement that goal. And so at that point, they aren't just enforcing a static law, they actually are regularly changing that law in order to adapt to the different needs at different times. And so in some ways, their regulations are changing the law, but the Supreme Court has approved that because they're still acting as an enforcer. And so it starts to enter this grayer area of how the executive branch functions. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, that's a perfect summary. What you'd say is the law is that the prices are equal. How that functions depends on the executive. And you could say there was a line crossed here,
and
or there
how
wasn't.
It's interpreted to some degree, right?
Right. There's always room for interpretation. And if you actually know the way economics works, there's massive room for interpretation here. But in their mind, that's not what they're looking at. They're not looking for a loophole here. This is a practical problem. Look, we have a better way to plan the economy, but it requires us to adapt this all the time. And if we spend all our time adapting this, we can't be doing other things. Do you want Congress to spend its time updating this law every month, or I don't know how often it would actually need updating, but, checking these numbers, running these numbers? Surely this legislative branch's time is better spent with other matters, right? So you get
it's not just a matter of time, it's a matter of the democratic aspect, is that each time they discuss it, they have to get the votes. If they don't get the votes, the price can't change. And so if political winds change, then this whole goal dissolves. It can't happen.
Yes, which is critically important if you think that the winds might change. You've pointed out something really useful.
Because the winds always change.
The winds always change. It's much harder to undo a law than it is to stop the passage of a law. You can stop the passage of a law relatively easy compared to passing a law that gets rid of a law already in place. People stop laws from passing all the time. People do not undo laws that have been passed very often. It's very rare once it gets passed. So this is a way in which to make the will of the legislature that's there now permanent. That is worth pointing out, because that's clearly where this trends towards.
And you can see it even more clearly today when you look at agencies and you look at systems that have so much momentum and power that the idea of removing them is anathema. You know what I mean? You talk about, like, a great example is Social Security. The data is clear that Social Security is not sustainable, which means Social Security is going to collapse, which is obviously a problem. But Social Security is not just a law, it's a living, breathing organism that needs to be killed in order to be replaced with something. And that's not as easy, as Dan's saying, as not passing a law. You have to do something, and in order to do something, you have to have the political capital to do so, which no one's ever been able to muster because there are so many people who currently benefit from the Social Security system as it stands, which is why everyone looks at it and says the inevitable result is that Social Security will stay until it collapses under its own weight, because no one can remove it.
Yes, which seems ridiculous, but it's political reality in terms of that imbalance. The fact that it seems way harder to kill something that's alive.
You have an agency that cannot be stopped by the Congress, even if Congress wants to.
So this brings us to, that was 1928. 7 years later, they're dealing with something much more serious. The National Industrial Recovery Act, one of the things it does is it gives industrial and trade associations the responsibility for drawing up codes for fair competition. People talk about how you don't want businesses regulating themselves. Clever businesses have always been doing that. They've always been the ones who are negotiating the terms of the charter under the king. They're the ones that are negotiating you can do that. Now, maybe not all of them do that, and certainly businesses have a tendency to be against restrictions to a degree and in many circumstances. But there's also
but big business and government working together to protect big businesses, a tale as old as time. And not just in the United States. You can go, as you say, back to medieval guilds who organized their power and got authorization from the king that allowed them to exercise a monopoly. And that's a very long-standing ancient practice.
Yeah, we talk about crony capitalism. The crony aspect of it, of a group of people with business interests that are able to manipulate the powers that be for their own benefit, is ancient. Now, it may look slightly different in capitalism than it does under other groups, but in principle, it's the exact same thing, the exact same incentives and the exact same appeals and reasoning that they make to the powers that be. And it's always a problem. It's always a problem. It's always a tendency. So this act, they've got the industrial trade associations drawing up codes for fair competition. The explicit goals are to minimize competition, raise prices, and restrict production. That's what unions attempt to do. It's for their benefit of their workers. People don't realize how they keep wages high for their employees is partially by restricting other people from competing and doing these other things. Some socialists are very open about that and recognize that. Others have no idea. Then the president approves them on the basis that they meet certain standards. And in cases where there wasn't a code built up by these industrial and trade associations, it gives this National Industrial Recovery Act gives the president the power to prescribe his own codes in, quote, any transaction in or affecting interstate or foreign commerce, close quote, and enforce them by law. This would give the president that clause at this point is being interpreted in a way that he can basically do anything regarding the economy. The court strikes this down. The court does not allow this to stand. They go, there is not enough criteria here given by the legislature to limit the president's power. As before we had, you want equal prices in these circumstances. That's much more closed. This is much more open-ended. And it's struck down. The thing is, this is during FDR, and FDR, if you know things about the New Deal and things, he really changes the way the United States works at a fundamental level in a way that no president has. There's some competition in various ways, but in terms of just the scale and his influence, it's just massive. And within a decade, he's going to replace 8 of the Supreme Court justices.
Yeah, everyone knows the story of how, well, not everyone, but most people are familiar with the story of how FDR threatened to pack the court, right? Which means to increase the number of justices in order to manipulate the court. He ends up not doing that, but after threatening to do that, 2 things happen. The first thing that happens is the court starts to bend towards his will in large part to avoid that from happening, right? Their cases do start to change a little bit. But the second thing that's happening is that over the course of his presidency, he ends up selecting 8 Supreme Court justices, which means that when FDR leaves office, the Supreme Court is an FDR court. And people kind of leave out that detail when they talk about Supreme Court packing, is that people argued that this was a case where the court won, and the rule of law won against FDR. And that is just not the whole story. It's really
they won
not.
The battle, but they lost the war. He was there for long enough that he was able to replace 8 of them. It really turned even the Supreme Court justices that were in his favor. When he threatened to pack the courts, it really turned them against him, which is partially why this gets struck down, even though people who agreed with him were already a majority. But then you replace 8 of the 9 and you can get what you want at that point. Though he wasn't around to see a lot of it. The court does end up basically endorsing this kind of thing in the future. Not a complete overturn of this case. There are some stipulations. But the agencies that are created end up having the kind of power that's described here that the president is prevented from having directly by this case. And this is where you start to get the agencies. You get the Federal Trade Commission is created around this time. And you get other groups like that spawning up. And looking at it as a practical problem, I've heard so many people say, the agencies are a 4th branch of government. We need to get rid of them. And I think, okay, which 90% of the things the government does would you like to eliminate? Because
or who's going to
yes
who's going to
give
regulate?
Us an alternative solution.
Yeah,
give us an alternative solution.
If you look at these, if you look at the top 10 agencies and the things that they decide on a weekly basis, it's insane. It's insane the number of decisions that are made. Even if Congress was 100% in agreement about every single one of those issues, they wouldn't come close to having the ability to pass laws regarding each of those issues. Like, not even looking at the political aspect. Just if their whole goal was just to run these branches, they couldn't come close to doing it.
Yeah, people have no idea how much of our government is ran by agencies. It's the vast majority. It's the overwhelming majority, right? It really is 90+% of all laws and regulations are written by agencies, not by the legislature, not by your elected officials, which makes it worth considering, right? So where are these people coming from? Who are these people? If they're not elected, they're at least appointed by elected officials, right? Well, sort of. As these agencies grow and as their power begins to increase, as they become more and more necessary, the Supreme Court keeps running into more and more issues with them. The powers in the government were separated for a reason. That's one of the fundamental things of the Constitution, is that you have the legislative power and it's not the executive power, and it can't exercise executive power. And you have the executive agency, the executive power, and it can't exercise legislative power. And this separation of powers is the fundamental goal. So you get these agencies like the Federal Trade Commission. I'm looking at Humphrey's Executor versus the United States, this case that talks about this. In this case, the Federal Trade Commission is created deliberately by the legislature to exercise executive power outside of the president's authority, and to do things that the legislature wants done, and to do them in the way they want done. So they create this agency, an executive agency. It's a grant to the executive authority, and they stipulate the terms by which the officers in it are chosen and appointed. And the president goes to fire the head of it. And because he's not doing what the president wants, and the president's the head of the executive branch, it's an executive agency, right? Mm-hmm. This hearken of some of the debates around Trump and what he was trying to do with executive agencies. And the Supreme Court rules that actually he can't get rid of this guy, because, and they explore why. And this case is some of the worst, legal interpreting of the many cases out there, where they talk about actually the agency isn't doing it. It isn't using executive power. It's using legislative power and judicial power. So it makes these laws,
which makes
right?
no sense. Which really makes no sense.
It really doesn't. But this is how but think about this for a second. Because what they do is they make these laws and then they judge the people who violate them. And you go, wait. Well, hold up for a second.
You mean they enforce the laws?
Is
that what you're trying to say?
Somewhere in here was a word that usually applies with the enforcement of the laws, right? They must find who these people are and punish them. Somewhere in here, enforcement is happening. But let's pretend for a second it's not. Are we okay with the group that legislates and then judges people according to its legislation?
I just want to be clear that we call the FBI agents cops, but really we should be calling them judges. Is that what you're saying? Because they're not enforcing the law, they're judging it over there in their little agency.
Right, and we won't bore you further with an account of the Supreme Court cases. There's so many more that can be talked about where the power grows slightly, right?
But that during this period there's this transition, and that the end result of the transition is that you have agencies that are created by the legislative branch that are in the executive branch, but the president only has limited control. He does have some control because he does still appoint commissioners. You know, in cases the FTC, you know, the guy FDR wanted to fire was appointed by the previous president. And so it's still an executive branch, still getting appointed by the president. Just like you have OSHA now that's still acting for the president, but there's also this weird autonomy. You know, this person who was appointed by the previous president can still follow through on the previous president's policies, and the new president can't stop him. That's weird. Right.
It's weird, and you get this line where the president can't cross, where he has so much authority and no further. And why? Because it's quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial authority. Well, and so you go, well, in that case, then the legislature must control them, right? No. You get further cases where the legislature tries to control them and they go, no, you can't do that because it's executive authority. And then you go, well, wait, who are these people accountable to? Who in the elected government, if you believe in government by the consent of the people, that's an important principle at all, then you end up with these people who are neither executive, legislative, or judicial, who make most of the regulations and laws that affect society, and who are not accountable to the elected officials, be they legislative or executive. Now, the legislature could abolish them, right? They could be like, this agency, which we created, is now gone. But before, they used to have other ways. They'd have committees which these people reported to. They'd have,
they no longer have direct
They tried a variety of ways to directly control.
But they do have, you know, almost an emergency last shot at ending them if it ever gets to that point. But they can't actually regulate it or control it in a more reasonable way. It would be like if you were the CEO of a company and you had two options. You can let the company run or you can sell the company. And those are your only options. You know, you wouldn't call that person the CEO. You'd call that person an owner who no longer had any, you know, who wasn't on the board, who was kicked out and still owned 51% of the stocks. And so they can do something drastic to end that company, but they can't do the little things. And that's maybe not a perfect example, but it gives you that idea. That idea
that something is weird here. If there are three branches of government and they have been delegated power by one of these branches, then they should be accountable to that branch. But they're kind of in a gray area, so they're not really accountable to this one. And the Supreme Court decisions nibble away at the accountability that the legislature tries to keep. And eventually you get to the point where the legislature can create something that has more power than the legislator in some ways, more power than the executive, as OSHA has demonstrated here, judges its own cases. If you have a problem with one of these agencies, the way it works at this point, is that if you violate OSHA's standards, you're tried by an OSHA court.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's a specific court system unique to OSHA by which they determine whether or not you violated their laws. It's separate from the the law from the court system that judges
weird.
the laws of the legislature.
It's weird how it's set
a separate judiciary. It's self-contained in ways that it shouldn't be. You can eventually appeal your way out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the system, where it's set up, is so unfavorable to the people who are going up against it in ways that other courts can't be. There are problems at every level of this. There's problems that really mess things up.
Well, and
every step along the way here.
And what's happening with OSHA today is a great example of that, because what you have is OSHA is created as part of the Department of Labor. It's created by the legislative branch in order to fulfill both legislative and executive functions. It's created by the legislative branch, and so the Supreme Court allows it to do things that the executive branch is not normally allowed to do. And it's allowed to do things, as exemplified here, that the president himself can't do. And yet, here we have a situation where the president is using OSHA to do something that shouldn't be done by the president. You know what I mean? It would actually be simpler if it would actually be better, not just simpler, it would be better if it were an official fourth branch of the government. Because the problem is that it's not. Sometimes it's more independent of the executive branch, and the executive branch can't rein it in. And sometimes it is more cooperative with the executive branch, and the executive branch can use that to use power that the executive branch was never meant to have. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And that also varies from agency to agency. You know, you've got huge agencies, you know, the FBI, the FDA, you know, I mean, you look at COVID, the FDA and the CDC, how much power did they wield in the past 2 years? It's actually a crazy amount of the decisions that were being made by these agencies, and also the NIH. You know, these agencies were in so many ways calling the shots. You know, we weren't waiting to hear what Congress had to say. We were waiting to hear what the CDC had to say. You know, in terms of how we handled not just our everyday lives, but an actual crisis, is we handled it through the use of agencies. They decided, and that's crazy. And they're still deciding. But the end result of this is that as the United States comes to face, you know, not just normal everyday life, but this massive crisis in terms of COVID, the leaders that we look to, the government, the United States government that was making the most decisions was not Congress, was not even the president. In most cases, it was the FDA, the CDC, the NIH, you know, these agencies. I mean, that's why Fauci came to fame, is because he was, you know, because he's this representative of one of those agencies, and those agencies are the ones who were deciding. And that's right. That's how we handled this crisis, is through the use of agencies. And if you hadn't noticed, it didn't exactly go well, to put it simply.
It didn't. Well, and what you'd think, the initial reasoning with creating these agencies was as we saw at the beginning of that first constitutional case we looked at, was partially as an extension of solving the practical problem of the legislative not having the time and the resource to do certain things. But there were ulterior goals, one of which was to take key scientific decisions, or what they saw as scientific, as empirical decisions requiring expertise, out of the hands of elected officials, and put them in someone else's hands who was, you know, better suited for the job. Which on its face is a perfectly reasonable argument.
Yeah, on its face, what you're describing is this meritocratic rule by experts.
Yes.
Where let's get the experts, let's put them in charge, and let's let them run these agencies.
Right. But and when you say that, I think, well, geez, you know what we should also do? We should also elect the best person for every job. Right? Why don't we do that? That seems like self-evidently the best solution. Why are we ruled by half-wits when we could be ruled by philosopher kings, as Plato calls them, right? The selection problem is a serious problem. It's a massive problem.
Yeah, because what you're saying is if we could choose experts to run these branches, then why can't we choose competent people to run Congress?
Right. If the problem is Congress is incompetent, why do we think the people Congress will choose will be competent? Maybe the world is such that incompetent people can recognize competence in others. But then why are the people electing bad at some point in here, you have to be like, wait. We're going to get something we don't want. We're going to get people who are not necessarily good at their job. And then you add to that we haven't talked about the incentives that then these bureaucrats face. These experts have some remarkably, their incentives do not align in the way that you would want them to. In the way that a market aligns the incentives of someone who wants to make money with someone who wants stuff, wants a good product, and the two of them can get together and they could work that out. The bureaucrat wants what? Fame? Prestige? The salary? What are they getting out of this? And what is their incentive in the position to continue to do well? And how would we know even if they are doing well? Once the authority has been assumed to determine the standard, right? That's what a regulation is. It's a standard of good. It's a standard of what works. It's a standard of what's sufficient. And how do you judge the judges as the question goes? That problem is not solved by appointing people with supposed expertise. That problem, if anything, is exasperated by having an official standard instead of competing standards.
No, I mean, a great example of this is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is supposed to be an apolitical body made up of not just experts, but truly the absolute best and brightest in the country. People. Hyper-competent, patriotic, apolitical judges who then are just going to look at the facts and make the best possible decisions for the country. That was the goal, and that goal was executed accordingly. Like, the judges who were appointed were not nincompoops.
No.
And despite that fact, the Supreme Court has done all sorts of strange and unexpected things because it's got weird incentives, because it doesn't have accountability. And anything that doesn't have accountability, you can never fully account for its actions, almost by definition, right? That you give these apolitical experts carte blanche on deciding what the law means, and sometimes they're going to use that power very reasonably, and sometimes they're going to use that power to make very political decisions, and we've seen that with the Supreme Court. These executive agencies are in many ways the same way, that often they are staffed with experts, and sometimes they are staffed with nincompoops. And I to say otherwise is I think inaccurate. I think you've got a healthy mix of both. But despite those experts, you still have the fact that there is no accountability. There is no clear incentive structure. There's no reporting to the people. And so you get a lot of weird things. A great example of that, since we're already talking about it, is OSHA. OSHA is something that had such reasonable purposes when it was created. It's to keep workers safe. And yet, in actual execution, here we are decades later, how it actually goes about doing that is illogical. I work in a warehouse that, is very involved with OSHA because, from the tiniest workplace accident, OSHA gets involved, OSHA does inspections. And the OSHA inspectors come in and they always, we talk about it here at work and we say, hey, if OSHA comes in, it's going to be very bad. I'm like, well, why is it going to be bad? Is this a super unsafe place to work? They're like, no, OSHA has quotas. The inspectors have quotas. They're going to come in and they're going to say that you have $200,000 worth of fines, but we're only going to fine you for $50,000 because that's our quota. And I'm like, well, I don't understand. If we have $200,000 worth of fines because we're that unsafe, shouldn't they fine us the $200,000 to make sure that we fix those problems? But no, that's not how it works, because you've got these weird incentives set up. You got this weird thing. I mean, There's fines for whether a pallet is laying down flat or on it or standing up. And who decided that a pallet standing up, a 4-foot by 4-foot wood pallet weighs about, 25, 30 pounds. Who decided, that's not even that much. It might be under 20 pounds. Who decided that pallet
presumably it's
going
to tip over on you.
It's going to tip
which means
over.
it's going to be a fraction of that weight that's actually.
Yeah, exactly. And so who decided that being on its side is worth exactly $400 or $500? Who decided that was the fine that was appropriate for that? It's all arbitrary. It's all arbitrary. It's just not operating like you'd expect it to operate. If it were a police matter, it'd be very different. Someone would file a complaint and say, hey, this is an unsafe place. The police would come in and say either yes or no. Yes, it's unsafe, in which case you have to fix it, and there might be fines, but our primary goal is to make sure you fix it. It's not to fine you. It's to stop the problem. But OSHA doesn't seem to operate that way. OSHA is weird. Every time we interact with OSHA in my workplace, I'm always weirded out by how it operates, because it doesn't always feel like the goal of OSHA is to protect the workers.
It is weird. I have yet to hear an explanation of an encounter with an agency that made sense to me, except the ones where the person representing the agency was like, don't worry about it. I'm just, just violated their own rules, right? Those are the most reasonable encounters I've heard of with agencies. It's so many of the things so much of it is arbitrary. So much of the safety standards are arbitrary. So much of it is for the same reasons that risk management in general is so subjective. And the same reason that the value is fundamentally subjective, right? As you said, attaching prices to these things is inherently arbitrary. Now, the argument is that yes, but by and large, it's worth it because it's made us safer. And the question is not that whether or not regulation inherently makes us safer. The question is, and having safety standards and those kind of things. The question is, by what mechanism do you do that effectively? And government agencies...
Well, yeah, I would say there's two questions. There is the question of, does regulation make us safer?
Yes.
There's the question of, is regulation justified? And then, even if you've answered both those questions, the third question then has to be, okay, we need regulation. In what form is it going to be executed? And how is it going to be set up in order to make sure that it actually executes its function and doesn't end up with a whole bunch of nasty side effects? And to answer that third question, this system we have now is clearly not working.
Yes, I think everyone could agree on it. If we took the time and we really went into the details, I think anybody who did that would come away being like, this is really weird. This doesn't seem to be effective. And as far as the power concerns go, you were talking about how the Supreme Courts are insulated from consequences and accountability by design, really deliberate design in the case of the Supreme Court. The agencies, not so much. That kind of happens spontaneously through a series of Supreme Court decisions and just kind of growth over the years. That was considered a virtue of the Supreme Court, that it was designed that way to protect them from the political fallout of unfavorable decisions and from the political machinations of the legislature and from the figurehead of the president and so on. But it looks much less fine if they have massive power. They have very little power and it's exercised in a way that is supposed to be more expertise and things. That looks very different than what the Supreme Court has turned into. The intended realm of the Supreme Court was certainly much more narrow, at least in theory, if not, maybe the practical principles end up leading to what it has become one way or another. There's certainly a case for that.
Maybe that's part of what I was arguing, Dan, is that if you fill a room full of experts and you tell them this is what we want you to do is to solve problems and you have no accountability, then at some point the experts in that room are going to say, well, then we should have more power. If we're effective in this area, we're going to be effective in that area, and we might as well grab more. And I think that was a natural result with the Supreme Court, and is a natural result with these agencies. I was very intentional when I made that comparison.
No, and I agree with that completely. That despite what appeared to be decent reasoning, at least, some good reasons for why they designed the Supreme Court the way they did, I think its growth was essentially inevitable. and it's
and I'm not trying to accuse any of those who originally had that idea as being idiots for not seeing that. Yeah. Obviously, it's easy for us to see it now after the fact, but it's also ridiculous for us not to use that wisdom now that we have it. We've got 2020, let's use it.
Yes, to see the way the systems have played out and the incentives, and to say, wait. Immediately, I mean, what is it, Marbury versus Madison, the first case where the Supreme Court deliberately, who was it? Was it Marshall? Deliberately inserts himself into the conversation, makes a non-decision, a decision that had no impact on the law, but was an exercise in power to extend the perceived scope of the Supreme Court. It was immediate that there was this step in. Almost everybody thinks that what they did was right, at least most of the legal scholars and things. There is room for debate there, but to see it go so quickly in that direction immediately is telling. Sometime we're going to have to make a lengthy case for regulation outside of force. Like you were saying, the question of, is it justified, in the sense of, can you justly impose things like, safety standards through force, is a really interesting moral question. Mm-hmm. I think, at least as a beginning point that we'll have to discuss another time, Amazon's 5-star review, the way you order a product, right? You can put a review if you would like to, and you can rate it and you can talk about it. While it can be gamed to some degree, and there have been occasional problems, I would submit that it is a far better regulation of quality products than anything that an agency has done or come up with. I think it's done far more to see that people get products that work and work well without any force necessary.
Without any force necessary. And of course, the immediate response to that as well, it can be gamed, which you've already brought up. But the problem with that response is saying, compared to perfection, Amazon falls flat. But that's not fair. In order to compare Amazon, we need to compare it against what we already have. So you have to say, okay, Amazon has the 5-star system, and OSHA has quotas for pallets standing on their ends. Which of these systems is more effective, and what are the costs for the two systems? And when you compare it like that, I don't know if anyone's going to be able to make a solid argument for OSHA, because it's just going to fall flat up against that system.
Yes, well, it's one of the things, the FDA is a big one that has such power in the way that labels work. I would love to see what a competitive market of labeling would come up with. There are some people who look at the labels and read what's in things and in the numbers that they give. Mm-hmm. But I can imagine that there would be far more useful information you could put on there. And a competitive system could allow competing labels. And so you could get effective labeling, right? And you could also have standards and things. The market has never been allowed. We just pointed to a market example. The market, people don't take seriously the possibility of market regulation, even when there are living, breathing examples of it being extremely effective. And it could be effective in ways that we haven't even explored because of the monopoly we've granted in regulation in some spheres, like labeling. Labeling, there's some range of things that you can do, but then a lot of the nutrition information, things like that is mandated. There's a clear standard that is given that is terrible and arbitrary and ineffective in so many ways, and based on an interpretation of health standards by experts that turned out to be completely wrong, as we've learned from food pyramid things. And anyway, there's a whole mess of scientific and expertise error on a massive scale behind the labels that we get now that have been updated but are still in some ways the same, and so on. It can't adapt even with the experts there watching it closely. The incentives to change are just not there, whereas they would be in markets. The incentive to create a new product that's better is always there. Where does that leave us in regards to agencies?
It leaves us back to looking at government. Our whole podcast here is rethinking politics, and we look at Congress, and we look at the president, and we look at the powers they have, and we look at the things we can do in the Supreme Court. We need to consider the power of these agencies. Part of the reason government keeps growing and continues to grow is because, as Dan said, normally what happens is, Congress creates a law, and that law does something, and then it can get struck down. But what we have here is Congress creates an agency, not a law. And that agency will grow and continue to grow unless it is restricted through extreme measures by the legislature, which rarely happens. And so what happens is that if you sit on the federal government and really don't do anything, the size and scope and cost and intrusion of the federal government will continue to grow. Conservatives believe in just staving off the tide, and they've proven time and time again that that's not effective. This will continue to grow unless something changes, and in large part that is because of these agencies and the independence and autonomy that they have.
Yeah, ironically, it was Republicans pushing this to a large degree initially, back at 1900, people like Teddy Roosevelt. But at this point, the conservatives have served the purpose of a semi-useful break in some circumstances on these things. But it's been a brake pedal is all. It's slowed some things. And in part, I think that's because the conservative theories lack the economic principles that drove the change in the first place. The economic thinking that made clear from the beginning where this was going, and the fact that planning an economy was never effective, and the fact that so often in the face of, well, this makes the world safer, the conservatives have no answer, and so they tolerate it, right? They pick around the edges. They throw up protests regarding freedom. Well, it's kind of invasive. It's in the way of entrepreneurship. It's in the, but have no place in which they can draw a line and say, no, this was the line. This is the principle. This is where it consistently works. This is the foreseeable, problems that would come with it when you cross that line. This is the abuse of power. I mean, I also think that you could probably get a lot of, I'm at least hopeful that you could make a case to a lot of liberals that these agencies are not the way, and that these agencies are not what they were looking for. Initially, the people pushing them were people who were looking at the Russian economy and going, look at how wonderful that is. Of course, we didn't know, at that point, what we knew about the Russian economy was absolute bullcrap. It was propaganda. And we now know so much more about the problems of central planning, and the problems of empowering experts to bypass the legislative branch and the electoral mechanics of the government. But I don't think that they would be thrilled about the unelected people either. I hear a lot of young people who are very much pro-socialism who look at that and they go, wow, these agencies there is a deep state. These agencies have way too much power. They're deciding things that are for their best interest and for the best interest of the special interests that be. They're not for the common working man. And they look at these same things that we're looking at and they go, wow, this harms workers, which is encouraging that they're at least looking at it, that they're seeing that there are problems here.
Yeah, absolutely. That this is not, it's hard to make a case for these agencies. The only argument you can really make is that this is what we already have.
This is what we already have, and I can't let the conservatives tear it down, or I can't let the...
Well, and I think often it's the conservatives who are going to make that same argument,
Yes,
the conservatives are upset about the vaccine mandate, but I'm not hearing conservatives saying we shouldn't have had OSHA in the first place.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, this
right.
because conservatives were a fan of OSHA, you know what I mean? And as you said, this is not necessarily a partisan issue. It's an issue of, this is the system as it is, and so much of the system is this way, but it is not for the people, as you were saying, not even for conservatives or not for liberals, but not for the people in general, because these systems in the end are only going to be good for themselves.
Yeah, and I really want to make the case at some point and to try and get the word out there, because there doesn't appear to be an alternative if you believe that the regulations are necessary. I am so convinced that we would have better regulations through the market, not no regulations, better regulations using market mechanisms. which is
but
people
even
think that
but
you've
even
got
barring that, Dan, even if you believe that the government should regulate certain aspects of life, there are ways to do that where you have accountability, where you have the ability to rein that in, and you have the ability to control what's actually going on so that it doesn't become its own autonomous, completely independent organization. It's not either or. There are other options here that are more than viable, and there are whole segments of regulation that, as Dan's saying, are not just possible in the free market, but are so easy and logical in the free market.
It would be easy and vastly superior. Right. It's and so many people don't even think that that's a possibility. They say, well, we will take these regulations because we must have regulations. And I go, yes, you want safety standards. You want quality control. You want all these things. And all of those things can and would be handled, because people want them. Like people, the fact that everybody wants them is evidence enough that you would get them with or without the direct intervention of the government. The question is, would it be better? And I think it would be much better, but that's a case we'll have to make another time.
And with that, thank you for listening.
Have a good one.
This has been an episode of Rethinking Politics. You can find us on all of the major podcasting apps or on YouTube. You can reach out to us at rethinkingpoliticspodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our website at rethinkingpolitics.podbean.com, where you can support us via Patreon. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.